Hello guys. Imagine yourself stepping into a world without heaters, no warm electric blankets, no modern stoves humming in the corner. The only light is the glow of the fire, the crackling wood sending sparks into the night air. Outside, the wind howls across a frozen landscape, sweeping snow across the plains, rattling the trees and seeping into every open gap. The ground itself feels like ice and the temperature plunges far below freezing. Now picture having to survive in that environment, not just for a night or two, but for an entire season. For Native American tribes of North America, this was reality, and yet they not only survived, they thrived. Their ingenuity, deep understanding of the land, and cultural practices helped them endure brutal winters in ways that might shock us today. But before we begin our journey into the wisdom of the past, pause for a moment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a quick comment telling me your location and the local time where you are listening. It always fascinates me to know where these stories are being heard around the world. Now let's return to our frozen night. Imagine a village huddled beneath the weight of heavy snow, a cluster of round lodges, each one glowing faintly with the warmth of firelight inside. Families gather close, wrapped in blankets, sharing stories and laughter despite the icy grip of winter outside. How is this possible? How did people centuries ago sleep in tents made of animal hides or bark, in conditions where most of us today wouldn't last an hour without modern insulation? The first secret lies in the tents themselves. Many tribes constructed teepees, wigwams, or longhouses, each designed with climate and resources in mind. The teepee, for example, was a marvel of engineering. Built with wooden poles covered by buffalo hides, it created a cone shape that resisted wind and allowed for heat efficiency. At the very top, a small smoke hole ensured that the fire smoke could escape while still trapping warmth inside. The hide covering wasn't just draped. It was layered and sometimes doubled, with seams carefully placed to keep drafts away. In the heart of winter, snow itself acted as insulation, packing against the outside walls, sealing in warmth. Inside the teepee, the fire was everything. Positioned in the center, the flames offered light, warmth, and a sense of safety. But the fire alone wasn't enough. The floor was layered with hides, reeds, or mats to keep the icy ground from stealing away body heat. Around the fire, families laid thick buffalo robes, fur blankets, or deer hides, creating nests of warmth. At night, people slept close together, sometimes shoulder to shoulder, sharing body heat the way wolves in a den or birds in a nest do. It was communal, intimate, and essential. But survival wasn't only about the physical arrangements of shelters. It was also about rhythm and mindset. Native peoples adapted their daily routines to the season. Winter was a time of slowing down, conserving energy, and living in harmony with the cold rather than constantly battling it. The evenings stretched long, filled with storytelling, songs, and teaching. Elders passed down legends, parents taught skills through tales, and children listened, wrapped in warmth, learning not just how to live, but why their people lived as they did. These shared moments transformed the coldest nights into seasons of connection and memory. Clothing, too, played a crucial role. Furs were carefully chosen not just for warmth, but for function. Deer, elk, rabbit, and especially buffalo hides became robes, mittens, and boots. Each layer was carefully crafted, sometimes worn fur side in for insulation or fur side out to resist moisture. Moccasins were stuffed with dried grasses for extra padding against the cold, while leggings and tunics overlapped to prevent gaps where icy air could sneak through. For sleeping, heavy robes and layered blankets provided insulation so thick that even the fiercest blizzard outside could be forgotten once dreams carried the sleeper away. And here lies another fascinating truth. Native tribes had a relationship with the cold that was very different from our own. Today we think of winter as something to escape, to push away with heaters, insulation, and technology. But to them, winter was part of the cycle of life, a teacher as much as a challenge. The cold tested resilience, sharpened skills, and reminded people of their dependence on one another. To sleep in winter was not only to rest, it was an act of trust, of surrender to the protection of community, the wisdom of tradition, and the shelter of nature itself. Yet, let's not romanticize this too much. The winters were harsh, sometimes deadly. Frostbite, starvation, and sickness were real threats. Not every night ended in warmth and laughter. But this is exactly what makes their survival so extraordinary. Despite the odds, Native American tribes carved out ways to not just endure, but to live fully. They adapted constantly, adding layers of hides, adjusting tent structures, experimenting with fire pits, and refining their clothing. Each season offered new lessons, and each generation improved upon the wisdom of those who came before. Now imagine lying in one of those teepees, the fire casting dancing shadows across the curved walls. Outside, the snow falls silently, blanketing the world in white. Inside, wrapped in buffalo hides, you hear the voice of an elder sharing a tale of how the stars came to be, or how animals once spoke to humans. The warmth of the fire mixes with the warmth of the story, and suddenly the cold no longer feels like an enemy. It feels like a backdrop, a reminder that within the harshest conditions, the human spirit can still find comfort, meaning, and even joy. That's the essence of how Native Americans slept in winter without freezing. It wasn't one secret, but a combination of design, community, knowledge, and perspective. And in this video, we're going to uncover more of those details, layer by layer, story by story, so that you can step into their world and see just how remarkable their winter lives truly were. As the night deepened and the winds howled across the plains, one of the greatest defenses Native Americans had against the bitter cold was knowledge passed down through generations. This was survival wisdom rooted not in books but in lived experience, centuries of trial and error, observation, and adaptation. What seems impossible to us today, sleeping in sub-zero weather without modern insulation, was for them a way of life, and within this lifestyle there was a delicate balance of resourcefulness, community, and respect for nature. Let's begin with fire, the undeniable heart of winter living. Fires in native shelters were not simply bonfires blazing recklessly in the middle of the room. They were carefully managed, small enough to conserve wood, yet large enough to radiate steady heat. The shape of the teepee or wigwam funneled the smoke upward through a vent, while adjustable flaps allowed people to control airflow depending on the weather. On windy nights, the flaps could be closed tight to hold in heat. On clear nights, they might be left open slightly for better ventilation. This wasn't random guesswork, it was architecture born from deep observation of how fire, air, and smoke interact. But a fire could only do so much. The real secret to keeping warm was layers. Layers in clothing, layers in bedding, and even layers in how families positioned themselves. In most cases, children slept in the innermost circle, closest to the fire, shielded by the warmth of parents and grandparents around them. Adults, often more resilient to cold, formed the outer rings. This simple arrangement meant the most vulnerable were always protected. Even in their sleeping patterns, community was woven into survival. Another often overlooked element was the use of the earth itself. Many winter shelters were partially dug into the ground, creating what we might think of as semi-subterranean houses. By building downward, tribes used the insulating power of the earth to shield against wind and retain heat. The coldest air sits above the ground, but a few feet below the surface, temperatures remain relatively stable. Combining this principle with overhead coverings of bark, hides, and snow created a cocoon of warmth that could hold through the worst storms. And then there was snow. Today, we think of snow as a threat, something to shovel away or escape from. But for native peoples, snow was also a tool. Thick snow packed against the sides of lodges acted as a natural insulator, plugging gaps and reinforcing the walls against icy winds. Some tribes even built temporary snow shelters, not unlike the Inuit igloos further north. The concept was simple but brilliant. Snow itself, though freezing, holds pockets of air that trap warmth. Inside a snow-covered shelter, temperatures could rise well above the deadly chill outside. Of course, we can't forget the role of food. Staying warm wasn't just about fire and shelter. It was also about fuel for the body. A diet high in fats and proteins kept metabolisms working like internal furnaces. Buffalo fat, venison, nuts, and dried fish were common winter staples. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, provided dense calories that could be stored and consumed during the hardest months. Going to bed with a full stomach wasn't just comforting. It gave the body the energy it needed to stay warm through the night. But beyond the practical, there was something deeper at work. Winter nights were infused with spirituality and storytelling. The long hours of darkness weren't wasted. They were opportunities for teaching, remembering, and connecting. Elders told sacred stories that could only be shared in winter, tales that explained the world's creation, the lessons of the animals, and the wisdom of ancestors. These stories were more than entertainment. They were a way of keeping minds sharp and spirits strong when the cold pressed in hardest. In many ways, warmth wasn't only a physical thing, it was emotional, cultural, and spiritual. Now imagine again that frozen landscape. Outside, wolves prowl across snowdrifts, their cries carried by the wind. The stars glitter like shards of ice in the clear sky. Inside, though, a lodge glows faintly with warmth. A grandmother sits by the fire, her voice weaving stories of times long past. Children curl up heavy-eyed beneath buffalo hides. The fire pops, sparks leap, and for a moment the howling world outside feels distant like a dream. This is survival not by accident but by design. Every choice, the thickness of the hides, the placement of the fire, the layering of mats, was part of a sophisticated system honed across generations. It's easy to underestimate this knowledge today. We're used to thermostats, central heating, and insulation hidden in walls. But in many ways, native winter living was more sustainable and deeply connected to the natural world. Nothing was wasted. Every hide, every log, every handful of grass stuffed into moccasins had a purpose. Their survival wasn't about overpowering nature. It was about working with it, listening to it, and respecting its cycles. Let's also pause to think about resilience. Imagine waking up on a morning when the fire has burned low. The frost has crept in along the walls of the lodge and your breath hangs in the air. It's bitterly cold. Yet you rise, rekindle the fire, and begin the day. Life doesn't pause for the weather. There are tasks to be done: fetching water, chopping wood, checking traps, tending to children. The cold becomes part of the rhythm, not something to fear, but something to live alongside. That mindset, perhaps more than anything, is what allowed native peoples to endure what would break so many of us today. What's remarkable is how this way of life created not just survival, but strength. Those long winters forged resilience, patience, and unity. When families slept together for warmth, when communities gathered around a single fire, bonds were strengthened. Winter tested them, but it also reminded them of their dependence on one another. In the harshest cold, they found warmth in togetherness. So the question, how did Native Americans sleep in winter tents without freezing, has many answers. They slept close, they slept layered, they slept with fire at their center, with stories in their ears, and with trust in the wisdom of generations behind them. They slept not in defiance of the cold, but in harmony with it. And in doing so, they survived and thrived through centuries of winters that would challenge even the toughest among us today. The rhythm of winter life among Native peoples was not simply about survival. It was about creating a balance where hardship coexisted with moments of comfort, resilience with beauty, and silence with stories. Each night carried its own subtle lessons, and the shelters they built were far more than walls against the storm. They were sacred spaces where culture and survival blended seamlessly. Take the teepee, for example, the iconic cone-shaped dwelling often associated with plains tribes. At first glance, it seems simple, just poles and animal hides stretched into shape. But in truth, it was a marvel of practical engineering. The cone design wasn't random. It allowed wind and snow to slide off easily, preventing collapse under heavy weight. The wide base provided living space, while the narrow top vented smoke from the fire. And here's something fascinating. The hide covering could be adjusted seasonally. In summer, flaps were opened wide to let in breezes. In winter, extra layers of hides were added, overlapping like shingles to block icy drafts. The whole structure was portable yet resilient, a true masterpiece of human adaptation. Inside, every detail mattered. Sleeping areas were often arranged along the edges, leaving the center open for the fire. Mats made of woven reeds or grasses lined the floor, providing insulation from the frozen ground. On top of these mats came furs, buffalo, elk, deer, layered thick to trap body heat. Imagine lying down on such bedding after a long day of labor. The furs enveloped you. The fire's glow flickered across the lodge walls, and the crackling of burning wood lulled you toward sleep. It wasn't luxury as we know it, but it was warmth, safety, and comfort, the essentials of life. Some tribes relied on wigwams or longhouses instead, depending on geography. In the forests of the Northeast, wigwams were built with bent saplings arched and lashed together, then covered in bark or mats. The rounded shape trapped heat efficiently, and when packed with families, the body warmth alone added significantly to the shelter's temperature. Longhouses, by contrast, were vast communal dwellings used by groups like the Iroquois. Inside these enormous structures, multiple families shared fires and living spaces. This arrangement meant warmth was multiplied and cooperation became the cornerstone of survival. But survival wasn't only about structures, it was also about preparation. Before the snow arrived, families worked tirelessly to gather firewood, dry meats, tan hides, and sew winter clothing. Winter wasn't a surprise. It was expected, planned for, and embraced as part of the cycle of life. Foresight was survival. Every log stacked, every hide softened, every dried berry stored was a promise against the coming cold. One of the most ingenious techniques used in sleeping was the layering of clothing and bedding. Rather than relying on a single thick garment, native peoples often wore several layers of deerskin, fur, or woven fibers. Each layer trapped air, creating insulation just as modern cold weather gear does. At night, these layers were supplemented by blankets of buffalo hide, which were incredibly dense and warm. In some cases, hot stones were even used. Heated in the fire, then wrapped in hides, these stones were placed near sleeping areas to radiate warmth through the night, an ancient precursor to the hot water bottle. We must also consider how deeply their understanding of nature influenced every choice. For example, when setting up camp, they rarely chose exposed hilltops or open plains in winter. Instead, they favored sheltered valleys, forests, or areas near rivers where the environment itself offered some protection from wind. Natural landscapes were allies, not obstacles. By harmonizing their shelters with the terrain, they reduced the strain on resources and maximized comfort. And while the physical strategies were impressive, there was another element just as vital: psychological resilience. Imagine the psychological toll of months of freezing nights, endless snow, and the threat of hunger. For many of us today, the thought is daunting. Yet native peoples approached winter with a different mindset. It was not only a time of hardship, but also a season of rest, reflection, and renewal. Hunting slowed, farming paused, and families gathered closer. Nights stretched long, but they were filled with stories, songs, and teachings. This mindset, seeing winter as a natural rhythm rather than an enemy, made enduring the cold far more bearable. Let's pause and reflect on what this means. When we look back at history, it's tempting to focus only on the hardships. We imagine endless freezing nights, hunger gnawing at the belly, danger lurking outside. And yes, those hardships were real, but they were not the whole story. Within those winter tents, there was laughter, storytelling, song, and a sense of belonging. Warmth wasn't just a matter of temperature. It was community, love, and spirit. Now picture a night deep in the heart of winter. The teepee stands firm against swirling winds, its frame creaking softly under the pressure of the storm. Inside, the fire burns low but steady, embers glowing red. A father carefully places another log on the flames, sparks spiraling upward. Children nestle against their mother, wrapped in hides, their faces flushed with warmth. An elder clears his throat and begins a story, his voice rising and falling like the wind outside. The story tells of how the coyote once stole fire from the gods, bringing it to humanity so they would never freeze. The children listen wide-eyed, the storm forgotten for the moment. That story doesn't just pass the time, it strengthens the spirit, weaving meaning into the harshness of winter. Every generation carried these stories forward. Alongside the practical lessons of building shelters and layering hides, survival was never just physical, it was cultural. To sleep through winter nights without freezing was to trust not only in fire and fur, but in the wisdom of ancestors and the strength of community. And this is perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from them. In our modern world, where we rely on machines to heat our homes and walls to protect us, we often forget that human beings once survived and thrived through conditions we might find unbearable. Their shelters were not crude but sophisticated. Their methods were not primitive but precise. They did not simply endure the cold, they lived with it, adapting to its rhythm, respecting its power, and finding warmth not only in fire, but in one another. So when we ask how Native Americans slept in winter tents without freezing, the answer is far greater than hides and fire. It is a story of resilience, ingenuity, and community, a reminder that survival is not only about sheltering the body, but also about sheltering the spirit. And maybe, just maybe, that's a story worth remembering on cold nights even today.